What's up? Today I'm thinking about getting new PC. So CPU and GPU is something I need to think about. And I'm using Intel now, but I have problem. It's 14th generation of Intel and it has huge problem, and when I getting ready this stream, I got crash on PC and caused so much trouble. And that's why I'm thinking of refund the PC I'm using now and getting newer. So I made a small list here. CPU 1, CPU 2, GPU 1, and GPU 2. CPU Intel Core Ultra 7, CPU 2, AMD Ryzen 7, 9800. I'm not sure how to read it correctly. And that was the CPU and GPU graphic board NVIDIA GeForce RTX 5070 Ti. That's the one, 5070. That's really new one. And another graphic board is AMD Radeon 9070 XT. And this will be gonna be released soon. So not sold yet, but it will be sold. And so I don't know much about these parts. I generally know like Core i5 79 I see, and GeForce NVIDIA like 6, 7, 8, 9. I know that, but that's what I know. And I do not know much about the Radeon and Ryzen. I know there is, but I don't know what these like. And when I think back about these Intel CPU, I thought if there is such problem like bend with the heat or something, or the 13th and 14th generation has a huge problem. And my price range is Core 7, Core i7 or Core 7, this kind of range. So that's why I was thinking about the Core Ultra 7 and Ryzen 7. Right. And I'm using graphic board 4070 Ti. So I want to upgrade the generation 4 to 5, but it also has a price. I think it can be expensive, I'm not sure. And also thinking about the AMD Radeon 9070 XT. Is that one? To be honest, I think it's the one, but and on news, the price range will be same, around same. GeForce, NVIDIA, and AMD. It will be produced more and price go down maybe. And also I'm thinking about there's some problem after they released some bug or BIOS update, these kind of things. So I want to know more about the CPU and GPU. So let's run together. Let's go.
The new 9800X3D is actually more than 25% faster than the 7800X3D when it comes to multi-threaded performance, and more than 15% faster in the single-threaded benchmark. In a quick Blender render, it completed the test in 100 seconds compared to 134 with the 7800X3D Intel. But let's check out some games. Every time we tested a bunch of games with the new CPU, Slim win, with everything else favoring AMD to a different degree. Even in Formula 1 2023, which was one of the few games where the 265K beat the 7800X3D, the 9800X3D was ahead by almost 20%, with smaller but still significant improvements at 1440p and even 4K resolution. And there are a few games where they ended up fairly close, like the Spider-Man Remastered, for example, where the 9800X3D was ahead but not by a huge margin. And it was the same in The Witcher 3, when again AMD leads, but not by any significant amount. But in the majority of 40 titles we tested for this video, AMD was very comfortably in the lead. Black Myth Wukong is a good example of that, and very hard game to run, with the new AMD being 15% faster on both 1080p and 1440p, and about 10% ahead on 4K resolution as well. In Anno 1800, which does bounce between CPU and GPU limits depending on the scene, the 9800X3D ended up ahead by almost 40% on 1080p. And this is not really a game that benefits from 540Hz displays, but it is still a very impressive result. Far Cry 6 is a game that shows some pretty clear issues with the 265K at launch. So here, the 9800X3D is leading by more than 50% on 1080p and even 1440p, with a smaller but still significant lead at 4K resolution. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 9800X3D is ahead by about 50% on 1080p, 25% on 1440p, and we ran into GPU limits at 4K resolution. While in Microsoft Flight Simulator, that can be both CPU and GPU limited depending on your setup, the 9800X3D showed a lot more benefit compared to the Core Ultra 7. Now, if you already own a 7800X3D, it is not really worth upgrading it. But I know that for a lot of you, this is the only game you play, and for that use case, the 9800X3D is the best option at the moment. Now, as usual, I'm not going to talk about 40 different games individually, so let's check out some summaries instead. On 1080p resolution, everything was running really well. Whichever game you throw at it, the CPU will run it easily on high refresh rate monitors. On 1440p, some games will be GPU limited and some will be CPU limited, but again, most games will run well on high refresh rate monitors, assuming you have a high-end GPU to go with this CPU. On 4K resolution, you are generally GPU bound, but in my opinion, I still think it is very useful to see a large summary of what you can expect from this CPU when you combine it with a high-end GPU. Because even though it doesn't just show the full potential of this CPU alone, you can still see that it can definitely make a difference in quite a few games on this resolution. And if we compare it to the 7800X3D, it is clear that the new AMD CPU offers a pretty significant improvement across the board. Now, there are a couple of games where there is no difference between them, and a couple of games with a difference so small that it doesn't really matter which one you're using. But there are also plenty of games where the 9800X3D is very far ahead. On average, we have a gap of about 11%, which is not bad for a generational improvement, and actually more than 8% AMD promised based on their own data. Even on 1440p, when we're slowly running into some GPU bottlenecks here and there are still plenty of games where the new chip is ahead by 10% or more, and sometimes even more than that. And at 4K native resolution, we're now GPU bound in the majority of games, But still, there are a few examples where just changing your CPU can improve the performance by more than just a couple of percent. And do remember that if you're gaming on a 4K monitor and using upscaling, which you probably should, the internal rendering resolution is then 1080p or 1440p. So even with a 4K monitor, you will still experience bigger differences than what this graph will show. Now, if we compare the 9800 X3D gaming data to the Core Ultra 7 200.
Yeah, this is an important thing for me. Ryzen 7 9800 versus Core Ultra 7.
65K, it just feels like you're comparing two products from a completely different era and not from the same generation. Intel is holding on to that one tiny insignificant win, but AMD is leading by about 25% on average, with plenty of games showing the 9800 X3D ahead by 50% or more. Even at
So for gaming, Ryzen 7 9800 has some advantage. Right.
At native 1440p, there are still plenty of games where the AMD is ahead by a huge margin, while Intel doesn't even manage to win one single title. On 4K native, we have GPU limits in a lot more titles, so it definitely got a lot closer in some titles. But once again, AMD still has a couple of games with a pretty significant lead. And assuming that you're going to use upscaling for some of the heavier titles, the fact that the Intel can hit similar GPU limits at 4K resolution isn't really much of an excuse. That being said, I do want to point out that Intel did acknowledge that the gaming data we saw at launch and data we are seeing today is not exactly what they expected to see. So they are supposedly working on pushing some updates in November or December to improve gaming performance a little bit. But looking at the gaps today, it is really hard to believe that they will manage to get anywhere close to the gaming performance of this 9800 X3D. Now, that extra performance does come with a significantly higher power consumption than the 7800 X3D had. And if we look at Cyberpunk 2077, which stresses the CPU nicely, the 7800 X3D looks extremely efficient, and it seems like AMD is letting the efficiency drop a bit in order to push some more performance. And with Intel improving their efficiency a lot, the gap is a bit smaller than before. But idle power consumption is still a topic with these new AMD CPUs. Now, if I look at the overall power consumption of my two test benches with a similar motherboard, memory, and peripherals, the Z890 rig used about 43 watts when idle compared to 65 watts for the AMD, with similar differences during light use. So if you're someone who has their PC on all the time and you live somewhere where you pay a lot for your electricity, that difference can really add up. And I have to say it's a bit frustrating that this has been known for a while and nothing was really changed. So it is definitely something I wish AMD would look into a bit more. So overall, the Ryzen 7 9800 X3D is a very impressive product. And as I said at the start, it is the ultimate gaming CPU that you can get right now, with Intel not offering a real alternative at the moment. The Core Ultra 7 is a more capable processor when it comes to other workloads, and it has a lower idle power consumption, so I guess it might make some sense for some people, depending on their use case and balance between work and play. But if you mostly care about gaming, AMD is so far ahead. Plus, it is not really lacking when it comes to general use either, and it still offers more than enough performance for most applications people will use, and even creative ones. And there's some other benefits that AMD has as well, like using the same AM5 socket, so you can just use an older and much cheaper motherboard for it instead of having to buy a new expensive one like you do with Intel's new processors. Now, if you already own a 7800 X3D, I don't really think it's worth upgrading it, to be honest. And if you want even more raw performance, you can always wait a bit more to see how the 9950 X3D will perform. But for a new gaming system right now, the Ryzen 7 9800 X3D is the CPU to get. assuming you can actually find one. So I managed to buy this one a couple of hours after it launched, but from what I understand, they're pretty much sold out in most regions, including here in the Netherlands as well as the US. Now, some retailers even said that most of their incoming shipments for the coming weeks are already sold out as well. So if you really want to get this processor, it is not a bad idea to turn on notifications on all shops in your region.
So Ryzen 7 9800 is really good one, but often it's sold out, so it's good, but if you cannot get it, that's it. So right,
Region, or even pre-order one, which is not something I often recommend. And I guess that alone should say plenty about the CPU. Anyway, this is all I have for today, but before I go, let's check out the sponsor of this video. This video was brought to you by Seasonic and their Vertex power supplies. These fully modular power supplies are extremely efficient and very for watching and for staying to the end.
right. Let's see some. Oh, there's some note. Not together. Oh, some error on graph. Frame time. Game. So it says 14th generation Core i7 is faster than Core Ultra, but it has program. That's a serious program. That's the thing. Alright.
The AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D is here, and it's made some changes. Now, do these changes make it better than its predecessor, the 7800X3D? Oh, and can it actually close the...
It's Ryzen 7 9800 versus Core Ultra 7. Which is best for you?
gap in multi-core performance against the competition like the Intel Core Ultra 265K? And most importantly, is it a good value for the modern gamer? Well, we're going to find out all that right here, right now on Robitech. As if 2 launches this fall weren't enough, we have a third contender for your hard-earned cash. And if you're building or buying a gaming PC in 2024, you now have 3 choices: the new Core Ultra 265K, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, and now the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. And like we learned in our review of the new Intel Core Ultra, cash is still king. And I do mean both kinds: the money that's in your pocket and the system resources that are aiding your CPU. So now that we have tested both the Ryzen 7 9800X3D and the 7800X3D, as well as Intel's Core Ultra 265K, we now have a more definitive answer to which processor or processors are going to be the best value. So let's start with price. The newly released Core Ultra 265K was listed for around $400, which this was supposed to be the MSRP. For some reason, the launch price was $10 higher when we made our Core Ultra video. As for the 7800X3D, we've seen this thing fluctuate pretty much all over the map. Newegg had it listed for just under $480. We don't expect prices will stay here with the release of the 9800X3D, so it is possible with the holiday season these might be a hot ticket item. That is, if you can find one at all, because right now they don't even sell them as mainstream Newegg right now. They're sold by third party. What about the 9800X3D? Well, at launch, the 9800X3D will have an MSRP of $479. Whether or not you'll find one at that price, well, that's anyone's guess. But what about the value? On the one hand, you have Intel. It's a new CPU that is less expensive, but you do have the new platform tax with Core Ultra. That means a new Z890 motherboard, and if you were upgrading from 13th or 14th gen and still running DDR4, that also means DDR5 RAM too. Luckily, the prices for DDR5 have come down. On the AMD side, you have a number of options. Now, granted, if you're coming from Ryzen 5000 or an older platform, the same would apply here too. You have new motherboard, new RAM. However, The options are much broader. You have X870, X870E, X670, X670E, B650, and B650E. And all of them will support the 9800X3D with the right BIOS update. When you compare the cost of a Z890 motherboard with a variety of X or B series boards, the price delta between the platforms almost vanishes. Okay, so let's dial things back a second because we should talk about what's new with the 9800X3D before we get too far along. The first and most obvious thing that's new is that this chip is built on AMD's Zen 5 architecture. On release, we saw the Ryzen 9000 series perform significantly cooler and a bit more power conscious than their 7000 series predecessors. So with the 9800X3D, what we have is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU that has a higher base clock than both the 9700X and the 7800X3D, while matching the 120-watt TDP of the 7800X3D. But the bigger and more significant change here is where the 9800X3D stashes its cache. And no, they didn't pile on more cache, they just stuffed it into the mattresses. See, in the previous X3D processors, like the 5800X3D and the 7800X3D, AMD stacked layers of extra L3 cache on top of the CPU cores. Now, the big challenge here that these X3D processors face is actually heat. And that awesome 3D V cache is actually a bit sensitive to heat in general, which means that power levels have to be tempered a bit to keep that heat in check. This resulted in slightly lower clock speeds on the 7800X3D and the 5800X3D than their non-X3D counterparts. It also resulted in comparatively limited multi-core performance and no overclocking. With the 9800X3D, AMD literally turned the design upside down because now the cache, instead of being up above, is now below the core complex die. This means that there is a better overall contact between the cores and the cache. Not only that, but the cores are also in more direct contact with the IHS, or integrated heat spreader. In other words, a cooler core can go faster and be driven harder without impacting the cache. So all of that translates into a processor that has a 0.9 gigahertz faster base clock than the 9700X, while only falling 0.3 gigahertz shy of its max boost clock. Granted, it's doing that at nearly double the TDP and default socket power, so we'll have to see what that all translates to into our tests. And you know what translates very positively in our tests? Viewers like you, who subscribe and ring the notification bell here at Robitech and also over at Robitech Live. And now, let's look at some data. As a recap from our Core Ultra video, we ran the same tests on both platforms within the same environment, keeping core components in our test benches as close as humanly possible. We also made sure that our Intel motherboard and Asus ROG Maximus Z890 Hero was running at Intel stock performance settings. Both the 7800X3D and the 9800X3D were running on the new X870 platform also. Okay, so let's start with Cinebench. The single core performance of the 9800X3D was not only stronger than the 7800X3D, but it overshadowed the 265K by about 28%. That is a significant lead, but it's also not terribly surprising, remembering that the 7800X3D and the 9800X3D have that stash of L3 cache. However, in multi-core performance, the 9800X3D tried to split the difference between the 7800X3D and the 265K with a 27% lead ahead of the 7800X3D, but it couldn't quite close the gap with the 265K. Now moving on to CPU-Z, we get a bit more of a humbling story for the 9800X3D. While it still had a 15% lead over the 7800X3D in single-thread performance and a 19% lead in multi-core, it just couldn't match the power of the 265K. Okay, so let's talk about power, because this kind of seems to be the thing that at least the chip makers seem to be excited about. We looked at the power and thermals under load in Cinebench. The 9800X3D averaged 80 degrees Celsius while drawing an average of about 147 watts. Interestingly enough, this was on average 3 degrees warmer than the 7800X3D and while drawing more power. The 265K, on the other hand, ran 7 degrees cooler at 73 degrees Celsius while drawing an average of just over 179 watts. So what does this mean when we look at performance per watt? Now, if AMD is still looking for leadership here, it's lost a lot of ground. So if we were to take our average Cinebench score and divide them by the average wattage for a rough performance per watt score, with a score of 156, the 9800X3D falls behind its predecessor at 211 points per watt. And it also dips below the 265K score of 193. Again, this is a very rudimentary metric here. It tells a story, but it doesn't tell the whole story. If we look at Puget Bench, we have some real-world comparisons for creative applications like Adobe Premiere and Photoshop. Now, during our initial test, we saw the new Core Ultra 7 fall behind the 9800X3D by 8% in Adobe Premiere and by a massive 39% in Adobe Photoshop. But remember that opener about day one metrics? Well, our Puget Bench numbers changed drastically after a microcode update on the Intel side. While the 265K still came up short in Photoshop, the update helped narrow the distance between the two from 39% down to 24%. While the 9800X3D still had a significant lead over the 265K, shaving 15% off that gap is not nothing. As for Premiere Pro, the 265K went from falling 7% behind the 9800X3D to leading it by 11%. This is basically telling us two things. First, it tells us that things can change dramatically after launch, like good soup needing a little bit more time to simmer. The 265K is actually looking better after launch. However, there is still our second thing, and that is, if you've historically looked at the AMD X3D CPUs as a all play and no work, things have kind of shifted. We're seeing some impressive generational uplifts in X3D capabilities outside of gaming. In other words, the new X3D chip isn't quite the one-trick pony it was, and the lines that used to be more clear-cut aren't. However, we also have an Intel chip that's looking better than it did at first glance. And since we've talked about better, it's time to take a look at gaming. And if you were hoping for less of an AMD-led bloodbath here, you're looking in the wrong place. At 1080p, the 9800X3D showed on average a 10% gain over the 7800X3D with significant gains in Modern Warfare 3's campaign mode, Fortnite, and Baldur's Gate 3. However, in games like World of Warcraft, Starfield, and Assassin's Creed Mirage, the 7800X3D reminds us that it can, and I quote, still keep up with the youths. As for the 265K, it fell 22% on average behind the 9800X3D at 1080p. Moving on to 1440p, the 9800X3D still held a lead on average, but the margin slimmed a bit between it and the 7800X3D. Again, it held significant leads in shooters, but it actually did worse than the 7800X3D in WoW, Starfield, and Apex Legends. As for the 265K, it fell around 19% behind the 9800X3D at 1440p. And finally, at 4K, the story takes an unexpected turn. While the margin of difference between the 7800X3D and the 9800X3D slims in games like Cyberpunk 2077, Apex Legends, and Fortnite, the 9800X3D goes absolutely ham in Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield. Unfortunately, in World of Warcraft, the 9800X3D just can't hold a Cobalt's candle to the predecessor. So on average, the 9800X3D was around 9% better than the 7800X3D, while the 265K fell behind the 9800X3D by a little under 13% in 4K. Now again, these are day one metrics. We did see some slight improvements with the 265K, but it was still the Steve Rogers in the back alley at the beginning of Captain America. It's scrappy, it's got heart, you can do this all day long, but it's still a blowout for AMD here. Now, it's not as big of a blowout for AMD when it comes to thermals. The 9800X3D averaged 50 degrees Celsius during gaming, which was 3 degrees warmer than the 265K and a whole 10 degrees cooler than the 7800X3D. When we look at wattage, the 9800X3D averaged about 4 watts more than its predecessor, putting it more in line with the Core Ultra 7 at a little under 59 watts. So what did we learn from all this? Well, for starters, we learned that if you play Call of Duty for the story, if you're an Asterian stan and love Baldur's Gate 3, or you're doing the Emperor's work in Space Marine 2, the 9800X3D, it's probably one of the best hardware upgrades you can make in overall gaming performance, even if you're on Ryzen 7000 series or 14th gen Intel Core processors. But gaming isn't the only place where we're seeing the 9800X3D flex. In applications like Photoshop and Premiere, the 9800X3D was more performant than the 7800X3D. It did take a good swing at the 265K in multi-core applications like Premiere, which is great news if you're a gamer and content creator hoping for better performance than the 7800X3D had. There is also something to be said here about how much time you're spending recording and editing videos. See, if you're editing it and doing it a lot, that 11% performance difference in Premiere is quite substantial. But we have a situation where the 9800X3D is 11% better than the 7800X3D, but the 265K ended up being 11% better than the 9800X3D. When we start thinking about these gains in relation to time, we start seeing where the 265K and the 9800X3D start taking two different paths, with one having higher frame rates in games while others saving time in production. While higher frame rates can turn the tides in competitive games, quicker renders can mean getting those play of the game moments online faster. Moving on, we also saw lower temperatures for the 9800X3D in gaming without a massive jump in wattage. That means that the 9800X3D can not only find success in SFF builds, but it also has room for that overclocking AMD says that it's now capable of. But it wasn't all gains across the board for the 9800X3D. Some titles like World of Warcraft, Assassin's Creed Mirage, and Cyberpunk 2077 either didn't care for the 9800X3D or were unfazed by it at the moment. The other reality here is that if you're using your PC for applications that are placing a heavier reliance on CPU multi-threading, the Core Ultra 7 is still leading the charge there by a significant margin in some applications. Our instincts tell us that Intel isn't done squeezing performance out of the Core Ultra CPUs, and if the recent microcode changes and Windows updates has shown us anything, heck, even if the Ryzen 9000 launch has shown us anything, it's that all could change wildly in an instant or with an update. And with all that in mind, what is your recommendation? Are you still going to just tell us what you did in the Core Ultra review and tell us to wait? So if you're on an older platform like 10th gen Intel or older Ryzen, and you're looking to upgrade and gaming is the highest priority, guys, The 9800 X3D is not only killing it in gaming, but it also opens up potential upgrade paths on AM5 that, you know what, may or may not exist on LGA 1851. Now, if you're already on AM5 but you want to boost game frame rates, the 9800 X3D has the juice you're looking for. This is especially true if you have a budget-conscious build with a 7700X or below. The exception here is that if you're already using a 7800 X3D, the gains in multi-core performance and improvements in some games and applications are nice, as is the lower thermal averages in gaming. However, you have to look at whether or not the gains are enough for you. Now, looking at our averages, the uplift is roughly 7 to 10% in gaming performance, 11 to 15% in creator applications, and over 20% in multi-threaded applications. None of that is insignificant, but for what you want to do with it, is that uplift worth close to $500 to you? So let's do a little thought experiment. If you have a hypothetical